On February 24, 2022, after months of hostilities and military buildup along their border, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. What many thought would be a quick and ruthless conquest turned out to be the exact opposite. A long, grueling war with the Ukrainian army recapturing more occupied territory every day. By all accounts, the Russians should have easily defeated the Ukrainians, but their numerical superiority was quickly overshadowed by their poor organization and logistics. With the superior weapons technology gifted them by NATO member states such as the US, Germany, and Turkey, the Ukrainians have not only stopped the Russian advance, but inflicted devastating casualties against their army and navy. In fear of being forcefully conscripted into the army and being sent to die on the front, many Russians are attempting to flee to neighboring countries like Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and more. I'm Malia Williams, and in this episode of Laker News, we'll be exploring the motivations behind these modern-day draft dodgers and the role they're playing in the war in Ukraine. The real effect of these draft dodgers on the Russian armed forces can be seen with their change in domestic policy. As Russia began to suffer heavy losses, President Vladimir Putin announced what he called a partial mobilization on September 21st, which resulted in many receiving conscription notices in the mail. For all men ages 18 to 27, 1 year of service in the Russian armed forces was already mandatory and had little room for exception. But now, these trained reservists are being sent to the Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine to help support the war effort. In addition to the large exodus of Russians during the early days of the invasion, thousands began to pour across the borders of neighboring countries after the announcement of the military draft was made. It's difficult to say how many have fled in total, but rough estimates are available. The largest targets for Russian draft dodgers are countries which allow easy access to immigration and travel visas. Most notably, Kazakhstan has seen over 200,000 people escape across their border. In addition, countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan have experienced such a large influx of Russians that demand for basic goods has skyrocketed. In Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, the cost of renting apartments has risen more than 70%. In Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, rent has also risen 40%. These rising prices and increased costs of living have left many citizens of these countries unable to afford many of the essentials they need to survive. Outrage, many anti-Russian protests have sprung up with demands ranging from the tightening of border restrictions for Russians to their outright deportation. Motivations from Russians fleeing conscription vary wildly. Many who work in sectors of the economy heavily reliant on foreign trade, such as tech-related fields, had little choice but to flee in order to escape sanctions. Others simply believed that they were fleeing for their lives. Regardless, large groups of Russians, particularly men, are stranded abroad and will likely not be able to return to Russia for years. However, that's not to say that Russia has failed to mobilize at all. Putin's goal of conscripting 300,000 men into service was achieved in early October. However, the Kremlin has made it very clear that further conscription orders are still possible. In total, the Russian armed forces possesses approximately 1 million active personnel with 2 million in reserve, but the experience of these soldiers can range dramatically. Many of the high-quality soldiers in the Russian army and its command structure were killed or wounded in battle during the early days of war, leaving the undertrained recruits to take their places, many of whom are without proper equipment and struggling with low morale. It appears that the strategy of the Russian armed forces to overwhelm the Ukrainians with their numerical advantage has failed and continues to fail. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, after the last 9 months, the Russians barely have enough personnel to hold captured cities and urban centers, much less any territory outside of them. Nevertheless, Russian and Ukrainian forces have continued to engage in skirmishes and battles. As the winter approaches, many fear that a war of attrition will replace the fast-paced combat seen during the beginning of the invasion. It's difficult to say how much of an impact the hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing to neighboring countries has had on the outcome of the war, but it gives insight into how the war is perceived within Russia itself. Previous generations in Russia were defined by the wars in which they fought. The invasions of Afghanistan, which began in 1979, claimed the lives of over 14,000 members of the Red Army over 10 years. Estimates place the number of Russians killed or wounded during the Chechen Wars in the late 90s close to 40,000. According to to the U.S. intelligence, the number of Russian casualties in Ukraine has exceeded over 100,000, more than both of these previous generation-defining conflicts combined. Not only has the invasion of Ukraine contributed negatively to the political stability of all of Russia's neighbors, but it will surely come to define this generation of Russians as well. Just as their parents fought in Chechnya and their grandparents in Afghanistan, the impact of this war will surely scar Russian society for years to come. I'm Malia Williams, and thank you for watching.